Man and Wolf, a delicious urban fantasy werewolf romance novella. Dark Creatures Prequel Collection, Book 3. Written by Ella Stone. Narrated by Naomi Rose Mark. Chapter 1. Scottish Highlands, 1998. Freya. You're letting me in. No, you're forcing yourself in. You need to fight harder. I'm fighting as hard as I can. That's not true. I know what you're capable of, Freya. Why are you doing this? Will you just back off? You need to try harder. I swear if you don't back off, I'm out of here. You need to confront this. You need to show your true strength. You need to back off. Freya, I said stop! The change was instant. The voice in her head was gone, although the pounding of her heart remained. Yellow sun filtered through the summer canopy of the forest, splintering and showering the girl in golden light, although it lacked enough warmth to banish the goosebumps. Both scowling and shivering, Freya marched past the grey-blue wolf standing in front of her without a second glance, and lifted a pair of black drawstring trousers and a vest top from a nearby branch. Both were far too big for her, but they were miles from the village, so you had to take what you could get. By the time she turned around again, the wolf was gone. You gave up far too quickly. The woman standing in its place bore a startling similarity to Freya. Same hair, kinky as opposed to curly, the same sharp jaw, and, at that precise moment, the exact same scowl. You're perfectly capable of blocking me out if you wanted to. Mom, I don't want to do this now. Still adjusting the strap on her vest top, Freya turned her back on her mother and started walking the path back to the village. Of course Lena was going to follow her. Her mother never could take a hint. Well, you need to do this. I've given you long enough to... To what? To get over it? Sorry I'm not quite so good at compartmentalizing as you are. I know, I'm such a disappointment. The path veered off to the left, but Freya turned to the right, climbing upwards. This route was longer, full of rocky ledges and steep sections, hopefully awkward enough to put her mother off following her, although the chances were slim. Most of the pack hated walking over terrain like that in human form. Unfortunately, her mother wasn't most of the pack. You have a birthright, which I'm under no obligation to fulfill. I wouldn't be the first. You should want to fulfill it. It's your duty. Despite what you believe, accepting your rightful place would be best for the pack. Yeah, well, we all know how I feel about doing things for the good of the pack. Already the conversation had gone on too long, but there was no avoiding it. If she turned back into a wolf, she'd have her mother's voice inside her head instead. At least this way she could put her fingers in her ears to block her out. You can't keep walking away from this, Freya. At some point you're going to have to face facts. She'd heard enough. Stopping mid-step, Freya spun around, her nose only inches from her mother's. You want me to face facts, really? Well, while we're at it, how about you take a bit of your own advice and you face the fact that this is not going to happen? It's just not. Had she had her claws, she would have taken a swipe at her mother there and then. But she wasn't in the mood for more wolf today. Knowing there was no escape, she resumed her climb through the thicket. As expected, her mother still didn't get the hint, and continued following after her. I understand, Freya. Honestly, I do. I've been where you are now. I had my doubts too. Whatever. Behind, she heard her mother stop and sigh. Look, please, let's not argue about this. I just wanted to come for a nice run, that's all. Why don't we race back? I promise I'll stay out of your head. I'm fine as I am, but by all means, if you want to disappear, you go for it. Unfortunately, her mother wasn't going to give up that easily. I'll tell you what, if you win, we won't bring this up again for another year. An alarmingly animal-like snort escaped from Freya's throat. Yeah, right. I mean it. I won't say another thing until you're 20. How does that sound? Well, that's only 8 months away, not a year. So it's a pretty good offer, you've got to admit. And I'll make sure none of the others discuss it either. This time she had Freya's attention, including Whipper. The whole pack. You have my alpha's promise. That in itself was worth considering. Whipper. Just her name caused the bile to rise up into Freya's throat. Not that she actually needed her mother's help blocking the beta out. She could manage it herself most of the time. But admitting she could do that was admitting to being a far stronger wolf than she wanted anyone to know. Especially her mother. You know you can have her out of your head forever? Lena asked, breaking the silence. All you've got to do is claim you're right. With another snort, Freya turned back around. I'm fine as I am, thanks. She'd barely taken a step when her mother's hand appeared on her shoulder. I'm sorry, I said I wouldn't mention it, and I won't. And if you won't whip it out of your head as a deal, then fine. I think it might be good for you. Make you find out for yourself what you're missing. So, what do you say? Deal? You win, and I will not mention this until you're 20. And 4 months. Okay, but if I win, you try. You take this training seriously. I already do. Her mother raised an eyebrow. I mean it. This is a fair fight. Do I have your word? Freya needed 1 more minute to think it through. Her mother was right about a few things, like the fact she was holding back. For the last few months, Freya had been finding it easier and easier to block out the alpha during their sparring sessions. But she'd acted as though nothing was changing. As such, Lena had no idea how strong she really was. It was possible she could win this. More than possible. Fine, she said. To the edge of the forest. First one to the well wins. She pulled off her clothes again and hung them on a nearby branch. But you stay out of my head the whole time. You're not cheating by distracting me. A small smile twisted on her mother's lips. Fine then, on the count of 3. 3, 2. The last number was lost as the women leapt forward, transforming into their lupin form. Adrenaline shot through Freya's body as she raced through the thicket and over fallen branches, gliding so effortlessly it was as if the trees were moving aside to make a path for her. The wind whipped at her fur as her paws pounded the earth, her head clear, filled only with the sounds and smells of the forest around her. This is what it must be like all the time to be alpha, she thought, at one with nature. It would be tempting, if that was the only thing it involved. You're going to need to go faster than that, she said to herself, already level with her mother. Faster and faster she went, her muscles burning. Muzzle by muzzle, they bounded over rocks and creeks, gliding over tumble-down tree trunks with barely a whisper between them. But a whisker was plenty where a wolf was concerned. Through the trees came the first glimpse of the compound. There, in the valley, houses upon houses, people milling about among the buildings. They'd almost reached the well-marked boundary, the place where they could go no further as wolves, and it was within her reach. She was gaining on her mother. 1 paw's length, then another. Her heart pounded. This was it, her chance to break free, if just for a short while. She was going to win. In hindsight, Freya realized she should have seen it coming. She was a full head in front of her mother when the older wolf's shoulder slammed into her side. The pain was instant. Yelping, the younger wolf veered off to the right, stumbling over her own feet. Bitch! She yelled in her head. It took less than a second to steady herself, but it was too late. By the time she had regained her footing, Lena was already standing upright at the well, grabbing one of the many slip-on dresses that were draped over the top. A wide smirk plastered on her face. What happened to playing fair? Human Freya retained all the anger, and the pain in her side of the wolf. Bruises would heal fast enough, although the same couldn't be said for her pride. You think everyone's going to play fair with you when you're the alpha? I stayed out of your head, just like I said I would. Her mother was infuriatingly calm and nonchalant, as always. I had you. I was faster. Possibly, but you know that's not all there is to leading the pack. I didn't need to hear what you were thinking to know how to beat you. You imagine I only know what's going on in my pack's heads because I can hear it? A good leader is so much more than that. Well, we have differing opinions on what makes a good leader. The guttural sound that rose from her mother's throat was cold and unforgiving, and would have seen any other member of the pack, in human or wolf form, drop down in submission. But there was nothing her mother could do to her that was worse than the memory of what Freya had already done. Save it for someone who cares, she said. Then, without waiting for a reply, turned her back on her mother and headed straight for the compound. Chapter 2. Michael. The car coughed and sputtered as it made its way down the rocky track through the woodland. As one of the tires hit a pothole, the whole vehicle jerked to the side, causing the CD player to skip. You'd think they would have given us a better car for this, Jessup said, his eyes on the road as he manoeuvred round yet another pothole. I mean, you think they would, right? It's our first meeting with them, and no one's been to see these guys in years. Try decades, even. Why do you think the Alpha invited us up now? Michael voiced the question that he'd been asking himself during the 10-hour journey. What's different? You think that they want us to make a good impression? I mean, what does this car say? I'll tell you what, it says Blackwatch is short of cash. Maybe. There's no maybe, this reeks of corner cutting. Maybe they want it to look like we can't be bribed. Jessup chewed on his bottom lip. That's not a bad point, actually. You know the rumours. These guys are supposed to be pretty savage. The women particularly. Maybe it was good thinking not giving us something new to drive. Perhaps they were worried we'd get carjacked and have to walk back to London. Umming in half agreement, Michael stared out of the window at the grey clouds rolling over the hilltops. He wasn't the most talkative person at the best of times, and today wasn't the best of times. There was too much to think about. Too much going on in his head. Jessup was right about one thing. Almost everything they knew about their current assignment was based on rumours, or had been for over 100 years at least. This was a chance to change that. Of course, everything Blackwatch dealt with was the subject of rumours, if you thought about it long enough. After all, vampires, for example, were a long, long way from being anything like the stuff of cheap movies and easy-read fiction. Half your life was spent denying things you knew were true. To be honest, it was no wonder he was still single. Being paired with Jessup was half blessing, half problem. More friends than colleague, as they had started their Blackwatch training together, both fresh out of university and ready to change the world. Side by side, they'd worked their way up through the ranks, all the way to their current position of liaison officers. But up until now, they'd had someone else with them, to take the lead and steer the ship. As much as he liked having his friend with him on this trip, someone with a bit more field experience wouldn't have hurt. As it was, they were on their own, and how they performed here could affect their entire careers. And the last thing Michael wanted to do was screw it up. The journey had started out fine. Motorways gave way to B-roads and the smaller, narrower roads, and, for the most part, they remained tarmacked well enough. Then, as they approached Inverness, the map took them on a turn into more rugged terrain. For the last 2 hours, they'd been travelling through wilderness, with the track barely discernible through the overgrown weeds, up and down hills, ravines and valleys, and even across the odd ford. It wasn't just the car's suspension that had been tested. If he hadn't fractured something with all the jolting through potholes, it would be a miracle. Now, for the last 40 minutes, they had been driving through a forest so thick he wasn't even able to tell if it was daylight or dusk anymore. Given that it had been late afternoon when they'd entered the trees, either was possible. However, more disconcerting than the lack of light was his partner's mood. The closer they got, the quieter Jessup became. And it didn't make him feel good. Jessup was rarely quiet, which meant either he was even more nervous than him, or there was something he didn't want Michael to know. Neither of these options was comforting. Okay, so according to the map, we should be coming up to a clearing, and then we need to take one more left, and this place should be visible. As they broke through the forest, sheets of pink and orange light blinded their view outside. The sudden onslaught of light meant it took a minute or two of blinking before Michael's eyes adjusted to the sight. Good God! His mouth fell open as he scanned the scene. He knew there were lots of them. Still, he'd expected just a few houses, perhaps a couple of caravans. It's a whole village. Michael heard his own awe echoed in Jessup's voice. Those cabins. Do you think they're houses? I guess so. But there are hundreds. I can see. Their vantage point at the top of the hill allowed them to observe just how massive the area was. Between the timber-clad huts were a multitude of other buildings, all varying in size. Cars, trucks, and even a couple of tractors weaved in and out of their view. "Hey, focus on the road," Michael yelled as Jessup hit yet another pothole. It was hard to blame him. He couldn't tear his eyes away either. Everything they'd learned about werewolves, their lack of education, their primitive lifestyle, this had put pay to all of that. Well, I guess it's time we meet the children of Eve. Chapter 3. Freya. Full-pack gatherings were a fairly rare occurrence. Ones where no one but the Alpha knew why they were called were even rarer. The fact that this one had been requested with no warning took even Freya by surprise. Typically, she'd just run a bath. "You don't think Whipper knows?" Chrissy whispered into Freya's ear. The pair had grown up together, spending their early years of school in the compound together. They had then been turned together at the same ceremony, and now passed their days bitching about Whipper, the arrogant, entitled Beta. At that precise moment, said Beta looked like she was chewing on a wasp. There's no chance she knows, Freya replied. Look at her. She wants to hit something. I wish I'd listened to what she was thinking on the run over. You know you shouldn't be able to listen in to the Beta, right? The fact you could even do that just shows. Not now, Chrissy. Freya glowered at her friend. She didn't need to have that conversation again today, or preferably ever. Excluding those too old or too young to take part in the run, the whole village had gathered in a clearing, around 1.5 miles from the village. While they made their way there as wolves, Lena had commanded them to change back when they reached this particular place, so, for now, they were human. The clearing was a popular meeting point for the pack. A sea of yellow dandelions and buttercups, it was one of the few places in the forest that was large enough for them to meet together, outside the village. As such, an abundance of clothing was always available, slung ready over branches. Freya and Chrissy grabbed the items nearest to them. The attire of the pack varied. Some wore simple slip-on gowns or trousers that they picked off nearby trees, left there from a previous transformation. Others remained naked. In the winter months, everyone would be dressed in jeans and woolens, which made transforming a pain in the backside. Which was why, in the summer months, less was definitely more when it came to clothing. Do you really have no clue what this is all about? Chrissy asked, as they made their way to the centre of the crowd. You imagine she tells me what she's thinking? Well, I thought you'd have an idea. No, not a clue. In truth, the fact that she didn't even have an inkling caused Freya's skin to prickle. Whole pack events happened only on special dates, like the summer and winter solstices or the birth of Eve. But the solstice was over a week away, and the birth of Eve not until the autumn. The fact that she wants us human means she's going to make a speech. She always likes to be human when she does that. Chrissy nodded in agreement. Hopefully she'll start soon. People are starting to get nervous. She was right. Furtive glances darted between different pack members, even as Lena made her way to a raised patch of ground. Only when she lifted her hand to silence them did the chattering die down. Here we go. One of the youngest alphas in the history of the pack, Lena rose to occasions like this. It wasn't just the way she looked, with her hair now tamed into a corkscrew of curls, her green eyes more vivid than any model in any magazine Freya had ever seen. It was the way she moved, the way the air seemed to move around her, how all eyes fell on her, even Freya's, even when she didn't want them to. Thank you, children, Lena started. Thank you for running here with me today. There is no feeling as wonderful as racing with my pack, to feel your thoughts burning with mine, our souls intertwined as one. God, I hate this bullshit, Chrissy muttered into Freya's ear. Tell me you're never going to be like this when you're the alpha. What do you mean? Our souls are intertwined. Can't you feel it? Freya snickered back. Besides, I'm never going to be the alpha. Several heads turned in their direction, with disapproving tuts. Suppressing any more smirks, Freya turned her gaze back to her mother. She would have felt bad ruining the mood for others, only she knew it was actual bullshit. Her mother never spoke like this when other members of the pack weren't around. Not to her, at least. You will, of course, be wondering why I called you all here today. Lena's eyes moved across the group. I know many of you have work to do, families to look after, but please, rest assured this is important. I needed you to be here with me now, to hear this from my own lips. When we return to the village, there will be 2 men awaiting us. 2 outsiders. 2 men from Blackwatch. A series of gasps echoed around the pack. Our children, we must go back now. Someone called. No, you will stay. You will all stay here. Her eyes glowed. Even in human form, they couldn't disobey her. The links had been in place far too long. Obedience down the generations was ingrained. They are here at my invitation. I invited them to the village. No. Why? Fury rose amid the uncertainty. Why would you do that? Chrissy leaned into Freya and repeated the same question. Why? Why on earth would she do that? After what they did? I don't know. A knot was growing in Freya's stomach. But this is my mother we're talking about. She never does anything without a reason. Please, children. Lena's voice brought them back to silence. I understand your fear, of course I do. I, like all of you, grew up on the rumours of Blackwatch. I know the stories of how they turned us into prisoners and fought to train us, to become their own army, no better than the ones who formed us in the first place, no better than our monstrous creators. But that was years ago. Decades. Before my grandparents' generation. None of us alive, here and now, has suffered anything at the hands of Blackwatch. They kept their promise to us, to give us distance. Freedom. Then why are you inviting them back? It was the second beta now who called out. Dominic. He was as loyal to Lena as they came. To hear him question her caused Freya's knot to tighten further. The pack waited. Dozens of men and women. Silent. Wolves are not lone animals. Lena spoke slowly, picking her words carefully. We live together. We hunt together. Our family is everything to us. She paused, and Freya felt the next words directed at her. A pack grows and shrinks with the seasons and time. We have experienced this. Over the last generations, with our freedom, we've grown so much that we have 2 packs now. A murmur of approval rumbled in the clearing. There was no rivalry with the South Pack. They were, after all, family. And while we remain steady in our isolation, the world outside is changing. We know the world is growing and developing in a manner which would seem almost incomprehensible to the wolves of old. There was a time when our ancestors would have said that ignorance is bliss. But we know this is not so. We know that much of what we have achieved here is due to our links, your links, with the outside. I believe that now, as society changes, ignorance of what is going on around us makes us vulnerable. Threats come every month, every year. It would be naive of us to think that in our seclusion and privacy we will be safe. We need an ear to the ground. But we have that already. We have people on the outside. Dominic questioned her again. But not enough. We do not have enough resources. We need Blackwatch. There was silence, until a single voice broke the quiet. Do you trust them? It asked. They have given me no reason not to, Lena responded. But at the same time, I, like you, have not forgotten my grandparents' warnings. Trust takes time to develop on both sides. This is a first step. I've given them free rein of the compound in its entirety. They may wish to speak to you. Please, invite them to dinner. Show them your talents. Tell them about your lives. Show them that our souls are deeper than any humans. Help them to realize they have nothing to fear from us. For it is only when people are afraid that they strike. Murmurs of approval and disapproval rippled through the group. What do you think? Chrissy whispered. Freya could offer no reply. Something was hanging in the air like static, a prickling that sent a cold shiver down her spine, as if there was something more for her to hear. It took just a moment to find out what that was. One last thing. Lena addressed the group again. 2 men are here, but I will be leaving with one of them to go down to Juliet's pack. In my absence, my daughter Freya will be the other's guide. She will be in charge of his stay here. If you have any questions, you can ask her. Chapter 4. Michael. Michael scanned the area. To all intents and purposes, the place looked deserted, like it had been abandoned after a hurricane or flood warning. There were signs of life, clothes hung drying on lines and randomly slung over walls and fences, children's toy tricycles and bikes abandoned in front of homes. But as for people, there were none. Where do you think they all are? Jessup asked. Michael ventured further from the car. The nervous anticipation that had been roiling through him all day stepped up to a whole new level. Why Blackwatch? Why hadn't he been content training as a bog-standard cop? He could have just said no when they recruited him. At least if he were a police officer, they'd have given him a gun or a taser. Where did the Alpha say we should meet her? By a well of some sort. Jessup checked his notes. Over on the west side of the compound, which I guess is... He turned around in a circle, trying to orientate himself. That way. Sunset's in the west, right? With Michael's heart performing a nervous jitter, they made their way over towards the edge of a forest. Is there any chance this could be a trap? Jessup asked. Maybe they thought it might be. It would make sense as to why they'd send the two most newly qualified and disposable liaisons. Yet being a trap would definitely make sense. Thanks, that's so reassuring. Michael was just about to make another, and probably even less comforting comment, when something caught his eye. There's the well, he said, but I don't see anyone. I guess that we'll just have to wait then. Given that they were surrounded by nature, there was an unnatural stillness to the air. No birds, Michael realized. Edging towards the forest, a new sight rendered him motionless. Jessup? Jessup! What? There, in the trees, what does that look like to you? What does what look like? The glinting, see? It kind of looks like... Jessup came up behind him, only to freeze mid-step. Like hundreds of pairs of eyes staring at us? Yep, that would be it. Michael's heart pounded against his ribs, as his eyes locked on the tree line. Shadows were all he could make out. Dark shadows and glinting pools of yellow, growing brighter with every passing heartbeat. A moment later, the noise began, a low rumbling growl deep enough that the very earth seemed to tremble around them. Wolves. Jessup stuttered beside him. They're wolves, aren't they? I don't know, maybe. There was no way to make them out exactly. Still, the yellow orbs appeared to have stopped moving. What do you think they're doing? I don't know. Do you think they can hear us? Do you think they understand what we're saying? I don't think they need to hear us to know that we're pissing our pants right now, Jessup replied. Despite the gravity of the situation, Michael found the ridiculous comment decidedly comforting. It was good to know that Jessup didn't have balls of steel after all, as he always appeared to when it came to life in Blackwatch. That probably explained his earlier quietness, too. Maybe we're meant to do something, Michael suggested. Like kneel or curtsy? They're werewolves, not bloody royalty. Well, I don't know. They have an alpha. Isn't that like royalty? Maybe we're meant to do something else. What do the instructions say? I told you we just had to head to this well and wait for them. Somehow, the fact that the eyes had stopped moving was even more terrifying. The guttural growl still reverberated around them. Perhaps they're just fireflies, Jessup offered optimistically. Do you want to go in there and check? The following silence was answer enough. His legs were shaking, Michael realized, along with his knees and his hands and pretty much every other part of him, and the joke about them pissing their pants was becoming decidedly less funny by the second. The growling increased. Shall we run? I'm pretty sure I feel like running right now. The panic in Jessup's voice only served to increase his own. There's nowhere to run to. Back to the village. They'll beat us. They'll catch us. At least we'd have a chance. But let's give it a try. I think we should just hold our ground. No, I'm going to count us down. Are you ready? Jessup? 3, 2, 1. Chapter 5. Freya. She had to hand it to her mother. She built the suspense wonderfully. All the growling and snarling. And, of course, the moment the poor guys had turned to make a run for it, she'd ordered them to transform back into human form and step out of the forest. Understandably, by that point, most of the pack were in hysterics. Oh, I wish I could have heard what they were saying. Chrissy was doubled over laughing next to Freya. I've got a pretty good idea. Gentlemen, we're so glad you made it. Lena's voice caused the sprinting men to stop in their tracks. Red-faced and panting, they turned around, eyes wide with shock. I hope we didn't give you too much of a fright. Still visibly shaken, with their skin now almost green, the pair straightened themselves up. One of them, the taller of the pair, stepped forward, with his hand outstretched, taking deep breaths as he did so. You must be Lena. I'm Clinton Jessup. We spoke on the phone a couple of times. This here is Michael. That was quite a greeting, the other one said. Pleased to meet you. His eyes displayed much more wariness than Jessup's. As they shifted from Lena to the rest of the pack, his gaze landed on Freya. Something made her stomach lurch, but she suppressed the feeling before she could identify it. "I'm glad you appreciated the entrance." Lena was still speaking. "The edge of the trees marks our boundary. You won't find any wolves roaming the compound. Of course, if you choose to go into the forest, you will be perfectly safe. From us, at least." "They're hot," Chrissy whispered in Freya's ear. "Seriously, they're all tied and suited and so square. You can't possibly find that attractive." "Oh, I think I could loosen them up a bit. Which one do you want, the blonde or the brunette? I'm not picky. You can choose first." Wondering, not for the first time, exactly how they had ended up friends, Freya elbowed Chrissy in the side. In spite of herself and her dismissive response to Chrissy's interest, she couldn't take her eyes off the strangers. She wasn't the only one. The whole pack was glued to their every move. "Well, I think I'm going to go and introduce myself," Chrissy said, taking strides towards them. "Do you not want to put some clothes on first?" Freya suggested. "No." While Chrissy and about a third of the pack began to circle the strangers, Freya attempted to pull her mother aside. She caught her eye about half a dozen times, but in true Lena style was ignored. After 5 minutes, and having waited long enough for an explanation, Freya barged her way through everyone, grabbed her mother by the elbow and said, "I think we need to have a quick word, don't you?" When they were away from the others, the alpha finally met her daughter's eyes. "Look." Lena pulled on a dressing gown as she spoke. "I thought you'd be glad that I gave you some responsibility like this." "No, you didn't." "No. You're right, I didn't. But it's time you started taking some anyway. Members of this pack look up to you, Freya." "They don't." "Yes, actually, they do, and you know it. You need to understand how much power you have over them." "I didn't ask for it." "Didn't you? What's that supposed to mean?" There was no point hoping her mother would give her a straight answer. She never did. Digging her feet in, Freya tried to think of another way around the situation. "You were the one who asked them here. If you don't want to do this job, give it to Whipper or Dominic. They're your betas." "And they are brilliant betas," Lena replied. "But they will always just be brilliant betas. I know you don't see it now, but this obtuse nature of yours, this determination to oppose and fight everything I suggest, that's the very thing that will make you a perfect alpha." "You were a beta and an alpha." "Yes, well, as we know, I'm exceptional." Her mother grinned at her. It was not reciprocated. "If you don't want this, then all you have to do is disobey me. And I'd like to see you try. Genuinely. I would." With that, Lena was done. She turned on her heel and walked back towards the men. "Bitch," Freya muttered, only half under her breath. Michael. In the space of 20 seconds, Michael had gone from thinking he was a potential snack to being surrounded by dozens of people in nothing but their birthday suits. Now he was having a drink on a hand-carved picnic bench with the alpha of the pack and her daughter. Today was definitely not average, even by his standards. "Thank you for inviting us here." Jessup started the conversation. "My superiors were over the moon to receive your call." "So over the moon that they decided to send their 2 most experienced representatives?" Michael chuckled. He liked her candidness. Exactly as they had thought themselves, and they certainly didn't look any more mature than the mid-20s that they were. "Yes, well, I expect they wanted to check this wasn't a trap," he replied. "Blackwatch hasn't heard from you in over a century." "You mean you were the cannon fodder?" "Pretty much." She laughed. "Well, you needn't worry. No one in the pack will go against anything I say. You're perfectly safe. So." She placed her drink on the table in a manner that said they were now done with the small talk. "I was thinking the best thing would be if we leave early morning. It will take a full day to get down to the South Pack, and I'm not a fan of traffic jams." Michael shook his head, feeling as if he must have nodded off a part of the conversation. "The South Pack? I thought there was only one wolf pack in the UK." His eyes went quickly from the alpha to Jessup, who was currently staring straight down at the bottom of his bottle, lips twisted tightly together, as he avoided Michael's gaze, not showing even the slightest bit of surprise at the news. "Sorry, would you excuse me?" Michael said, standing up from the table. "I just need to have a quick word with my partner here." He didn't care how unprofessional it looked, marching off and waiting for Jessup to join him. It would have looked a darn sight less professional to throttle him on the spot, after all. "You knew about this South Pack. And what's she on about, leaving? Was this planned?" "Look." Jessup lifted his hands in defense. "I only learned about it 2 days ago when I was on the phone, sorting out the last details of the trip. She brought it up, in a casual way, like she thought we knew there was another pack. 2 days ago. We've been in a car together for the last 8 hours. You didn't think you might want to tell me about it then? Besides, surely this is something Blackwatch should have known about." "Exactly, they should have." Jessup took a moment, licking his lips. "Think about it, it's exactly as she said. Blackwatch sent us here as cannon fodder. They wanted to test the water, and they didn't want to risk anyone important in case it all went south. But I've been speaking to Lena for weeks now. I trust her, I do. I don't think these wolves are the lying type, really. I don't." Michael turned his head back to the table. Whether or not they were liars, he didn't know. But one thing was for sure. The daughter was one angry wolf girl. She hadn't stopped glowering the entire time. Besides, this still didn't explain why Jessup hadn't mentioned them splitting up, when he normally said so much. "I still don't understand where you're going with this. Why not do one pack, then the other? It's not that straightforward. Blackwatch knew about this pack. They didn't have the foggiest about the other. For all we know, there could be even more out there. If I had just gone in and told them about this second lot, they would have wanted to turn it into a bigger investigation, put more men on it." "You mean you wouldn't get to be top dog?" It was all falling into place. "Think about it. Blackwatch thinks we're going to get them information on one wolf pack. We're going to deliver so much more. This is it. Straight line for promotion. All you've got to do is hang around with one sullen wolf woman for a couple of days, while I probe Mum for all the information about this pack and the other one too. We'll come back heroes. You've got the easy job. You'll be fine." Expelling a sigh that was half resentment, half resignation, Michael turned his gaze back to the girl. Sure, he thought to himself. How difficult could it be? Chapter 6. Michael. Prior to his arrival, Michael had felt that 3 or 4 days didn't seem like a lot of time to get to know the intricate workings of what had previously been thought to be the UK's only wolf pack. But with his less than hospitable host, he was starting to think it was going to be way too much. Jessup and Lena had left just after daybreak, taking one of her trucks, and leaving him by himself in the cabin he'd been told would be his for the next few days. It was nice enough, spacious and pleasantly, though sparsely, decorated. The cupboards and fridge were filled with fruit and vegetables, and enough meat and eggs to keep him going for weeks. Not that he had any intention of being stuck there that long. When drinks had finished the previous night, Freya had said she would come and collect him in the morning, to show him around the compound, although, given it was nearly 11:30 a.m., he was starting to think that wolves ran on a different clock. At 11:50, a knock reverberated through his door. "Just coming," he said, racing over to unlock it. He didn't know why he was surprised by what he saw. After all, he'd met her the night before. But that had been just after they changed from wolves, when they were all either naked or dressed in sack-like clothes. Looking like this, in her ripped jeans and black, strappy top, she was exactly the type of girl he would see in a pub and wish he had enough confidence to go over and talk to. Or, on another occasion, would make a mumbling idiot of himself in front of, when Jessup finally dragged him over, under the pretense of being his wingman. So, she walked through the doorway and took a seat in the small armchair in the living area. "I guess we should do this as quickly as possible. What do you want to know?" "Sorry?" he flustered, feeling colour rising to his cheeks. "You want to learn about the pack? Ask me what you want to know." "Oh." This wasn't exactly the way he'd envisioned the first day. He thought that perhaps she'd show him around the compound, tell him about a few of the different buildings and what they were used for. However, last night's scowl was still firmly in place, and the last thing he wanted to do was make matters worse. So instead, he moved across to his bag and pulled out a small notepad and pen. "You don't mind if I make notes, do you?" he asked, taking a seat in one of the chairs opposite. "Be my guest." Freya. All night she'd stayed out running, waiting for everyone to disappear so she could finally get absolute peace and quiet. Blocking people out was difficult. You had to work at it. You couldn't ever completely switch off while you were concentrating on shutting out other people's thoughts, which were constantly dripping in. Only when she was the last wolf standing had she finally got the forest, and her head, truly to herself. Racing, she breathed in the sense of the earth, the sweetness of the petrichor, the musk of the wilting leaves. Her muscles had burned with every stride. Was this worth it? This freedom? At times she thought so, and the rest of the pack obviously did. But she wasn't truly free. She hadn't been for years. Images she fought so hard to keep buried began to rise again in her mind. She'd raced faster, trying to shake them away. That was all she could do. Run faster and pretend they weren't there. By the time she got home, her mother had already left, and her role as official chaperone had started, although she wasn't going to do anything until she'd had at least a couple of hours' sleep. When she finally dragged herself over to Michael's cabin, the last thing she wanted to do was give him a guided tour. Thankfully, he seemed too petrified of her to go against anything she suggested. "Thank you for this." Balancing the notebook on his knee, he shifted around before looking her straight in the eye. "So, I'd like to get a few facts and figures. Okay, then? Great." He nodded as he scribbled down something. "Firstly, could you tell me what the current birth and death rate is in your pack?" His face was deadpan, like he just asked her about the weather. Certain it was some kind of joke. She waited for the punchline. None came. "Birth and death rate?" "Yes. How many wolves are born each year and how many werewolves die?" "I know what the words mean. It just wasn't the type of question I expected you to start with." "If you don't want to—" "No, it's fine. Just give me a minute." Scratching her head, she sifted through memories of the funerals she'd attended, as a sick feeling rose from her stomach. Natural deaths, that was what he wanted. Deaths in the pack are hard to forget. Being alone with grief is hard enough. Having everyone else's shoved into your mind as well was near impossible. If she was ever the alpha, that would be one thing she'd scrap. Grieving should be kept to yourself. Not that she was ever going to be the alpha, of course. "We lost Greta last year," she started, recalling the pain that had swept through them with the loss of their eldest matriarch. "El Delphine and Fredo, too, and Cassie. No, that was the year before, I think. Yes, we lost Cassie the year before. So that would be 3. 3 deaths in the last year." "Is that about average?" "Do you want me to go back and recount every funeral I've been to since I was 10? "Could you do that?" Michael. From the look she was giving him, he realized he probably said the wrong thing. And, in hindsight, maybe deaths weren't the best place to start his fact-finding. Turning it on its head, he tried for a more positive slant. "How about births? Do you know how many wolves have been born in the last year?" "You know that we're not born wolves." "I didn't mean—" "We are actually human. Human beings. Human babies." As Michael watched Freya's mood go from cold to sub-zero, his temperature was on a definite increase. "Okay, why don't you tell me things instead?" "Tell you things like what?" "Like whatever you want. What's it like to be a werewolf? What's it like to be in a pack? What was it like the first time you changed?" "That one's not hard. It's horrific." He jumped at the first piece of actual information. "Really? Why?" "Do you think having every bone in your body broken, rearranged and reset, along with the maneuvering of your internal organs while wire-thick hair sprouts from each follicle on your body, would be a pleasant experience?" "I'll be honest, I've not really thought of it like that before." "That much is obvious." A sudden sense of guilt shifted through him. The last few weeks, he'd been so busy trying to find information on the wolves that he hadn't really stopped to consider the fact that they were people, too. "So is it like that now?" he asked hesitantly. "Does it still hurt like that every time you change?" Her shoulders lifted and dropped in a half shrug. "Not anymore, not once you've got control of it." Control was something he hadn't thought of either. He scribbled another line in his notebook. "So you didn't always have control of it. How do you learn? How long does that take?" His pen was poised, ready for the answer, although, instead of replying, Freya lifted herself out of the armchair and crossed the room. "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend you," he said, closing the notepad and watching her back as she walked away from him. When she reached the kitchenette, she slid open a cupboard he hadn't noticed before, in which were stacked a dozen bottles. "Just bear with me," she said, bringing one of the bottles down from the shelf, "because if I don't get a drink soon, I'm never going to make it through this." Chapter 7. Freya. It wasn't that she had anything against the guy. To be honest, he might have been all right, even if he was a little on the dull side. Not to mention a member of Blackwatch. But the incessant questioning. It was like being forced to mind one of Chrissy's little sisters. And Freya did not do babysitting well. "So, alcohol," he said, watching as she flicked off the cap and took her first long draw. "Werewolves are okay to drink. It doesn't affect you in any way." "What, like turn us vicious?" "Pretty much." She laughed. She was only just noticing how scared he looked. Clearly, this one-on-one was nearly as uncomfortable for him as it was for her. "It depends on the wolf. The person," she answered. "I suspect it would not be looked upon too kindly if one of the others found me here, drinking midday with a non-wolf, but I know my limits, I think." Her attempt at a joke only increased the look of terror in his eyes. Maybe she could have more fun with this over the next few days than she'd imagined. "Don't worry," she said, taking another swig, before moving back across to the fireplace. "There are strict rules about changing in the village. It's not allowed in any circumstance." "Why?" "Risk of exposing ourselves, mainly. A lot of people come through here, deliveries and things. Not to mention the odd camper looking for somewhere off the beaten track. We have to keep our other selves secret. No one outside the pack can know about us. Well, except you guys now, I suppose. Besides, there are children here. Being a wolf changes how you hear things, how you see things. It's just not worth the risk." For once, he didn't jot anything down. Instead, his eyes stared straight into hers. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, he broke the contact and cleared his throat. "So you learned to be in control?" he stuttered. "What does that mean? I thought it would be natural." "It is, but like anything, just because it's natural doesn't mean you don't have to practice it. Like walking. People are meant to walk, but toddlers have to learn. But you're not turned when you're a child. We're still right about that, aren't we? You have to wait until you're older, don't you?" "Why is that?" Sitting down again, she shifted her legs underneath her. "I've always been led to believe that Blackwatch are the big know-it-alls, eyes in the sky, etc. I can't believe you don't already have this stuff." Sitting back in his chair, he shrugged. "Maybe a lot of it's in books and files that Jessup and I just don't have access to." "So there's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff going on, is there?" "It's an enterprise that was originally set up to control human and vampire interaction. I'm sure there's enough in their files to keep us all in nightmares for a lifetime." She shifted her position again, this time a fraction closer to him. What she wanted was to be able to read his expression. Reading people had always been a skill of hers. Or, at least, she thought it was. Frowning and nervous seemed to be this man's main defaults. That didn't fit with her idea of Blackwatch at all. "So why did you join them?" she asked, hijacking the questioning and turning it on him. "What would make you want to be part of something you don't even seem to trust?" In his apprehension, his fingers fumbled with the edge of his top, and Freya felt her own pulse rising. Clearly, this wasn't something he had anticipated talking about, and part of her wondered if she should take back the question. But then again, why should she? He was allowed to ask her whatever he wanted. There needed to be at least some reciprocation. "My father was a vampire," he said. "Not my real father. The man I grew up calling Dad. He was. My birth father left home before I was even 2. My mother was struggling for money and took on a job as a live donor." "Live donor, you mean?" "Food for vampires, yep. It's all monitored by Blackwatch and it's pretty tightly controlled, but still it's not a line of work most people want to end up in. It has its risks, as I'm sure you can imagine." Jeez. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but from the knot in her stomach, it wasn't any place good. "So, what happened?" His lips disappeared between his teeth. Motioning with his chin, he gestured towards her drink. "May I?" She nodded. He took a sip and handed the bottle back to her. Well, she was doing this job, and it was only her second time. The vampire was female, something she hadn't expected. Thing is, Blackwatch have these rules in place. They have punishments, laws governing vampires, just like people have, but it doesn't mean that everyone follows them. So anyway, my mum was at this woman's house, this vampire's house, and it went for her. Not just a feeding, but in the throat, aiming for the drain. My father, my stepfather-to-be, heard her screaming and raced in. Without even a second thought, he snapped the vampire's neck, then plunged his hand into her chest and ripped out her heart. Didn't even hesitate, that's what my mum said. Anyway, as he stood there, he promised her she would never have to suffer like that again, at the hands of one of his kind. Wow. Freya took a moment to imagine the scene, the effect that would have had. So which of those is the reason you joined Blackwatch? The actions of your father, or the vampire that nearly killed your mum? Both. My father was ostracized because of what he'd done, saving a mortal at the expense of a vampire. That's what the law says you should do, but that doesn't mean vampires like it. I joined so that I could get justice for vampires like him, and make sure no one gets put in a position like my mother was again. Her skin prickled, as if a cold draft had blown in from outside. These live donors, do they still exist? Surely that's barbaric. He nodded sadly, the first hint of an emotion other than fear she'd seen in him all day. As long as there are vampires, there will be donors. I don't see how there can't be. And it's far less barbaric than what would happen otherwise. And your mother and father now, are they... She's still alive, living by the coast in Suffolk. And my father, he tries to be with her whenever he can. He loves her, of course, he will always love her, but she is suffering the effects of time, with her own eventual mortality. Michael. From the silence, he was certain he had said too much. The way her eyes had locked on him, like she was somehow looking into him, or at least trying to. How far did a werewolf's telepathy stretch, he wondered. Could werewolves read people's minds? His notes said no, but he already knew they weren't up to date. Maybe she'd been in his head all along. The fact was that, right then, it didn't matter anyway. He knew the question she was about to ask him. It was the same one that everyone asked when they heard about his mother. Not that he'd shared this with many people. Anyone outside Blackwatch would have had him committed for just thinking vampires were real. But he told his girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, after the hours of Blackwatch training had taken its toll on their relationship, and Jessup. They were the only two people he had divulged this to in his adult life. And now this wolf girl with her pained eyes. Why he had told her his most intimate secret, he was still unsure. Still, he knew what was coming. Your mother, why did she not have him turn her? I know. It would have been easier in many ways. I think that the other vampires in the community might have been more forgiving if he had. But there were reasons. Me, to start with. I was the main one. I was only young, remember. She was worried what would happen to me if she was changed. There's a Blackwatch rule about vampires and children, you know. They cannot adopt them in case they abuse their power. You mean feed from them? He nodded. I think she thought that once I was old enough, I would understand what he was and what that meant. But by then, she felt too old to change. That's ridiculous, surely. You can become a vampire at any age. Of course you can, but my father had fallen in love with her when she was young. She did not want the woman he was stuck with for all eternity to be some older, withered version of herself. She's never said this in so many words, of course, but you can tell. He was expecting more questions about his upbringing, about whether his father did feed from him or from other live donors. Questions he didn't want to answer. But at the same time, he did. Never before had he been able to speak so candidly with someone. Jessup had asked out of curiosity, a desire to deepen his knowledge of vampires and thus help his advancement at Blackwatch, but had never considered the emotional baggage that came with it for Michael. And as for his ex, Sophie, she worked at Blackwatch. That was about as deep as their connection went in the end. He had thought she was a woman he could be honest with about his upbringing, but her attitude had been similar to Jessup. He was just another source of data. Aware that a silence had expanded between them, Michael brought himself back to the moment and turned the tables back to where they were meant to be in the first place. Aside from the pain, tell me the worst thing about being a werewolf, he asked. Sorry? Her head jerked up in surprise. Well, obviously there's some great perks to being a werewolf. I know you said it's painful and everything, but it must be amazing, surely, to be able to turn into a wolf, to speed through the grass and flowers, to be able to see a whole different world. That must be, well, I can't even start to imagine what that's like. It is pretty special, I suppose. Great, but what's the worst bit? You can hear each other's thoughts, right? That must be tough sometimes. Her mouth opened, and he found himself leaning forwards, waiting to hear her answer. A sound cracked in her throat. Freya. The worst bit, he was so innocent. After only an hour together, she could feel that sense of naive optimism. It was amazing, refreshing. What she would give to be able to look at life through his eyes. Even the way he spoke about his father. Somehow he'd even managed to find good in that. There was no good to be found in what she had done. What the pack, her mother, had forced her to do. A heat was building up behind her eyes. Swallowing, she tried to force it back. They didn't cry in the pack. Why would they? They had everything they needed, didn't they? And the other stuff, well, anything else was done for the good of the pack. That should be enough, shouldn't it? I'm sorry. Michael's face had crumpled in concern. In attempting to shake her head, a tear flicked free, which tumbled down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb. I'm sorry, he said again. I didn't mean to pry. It's... What was it? What was she trying to say? There was nothing she could tell him. That was the truth of it. Even if she wanted to, she knew he wouldn't understand. How could he? Even she didn't. So this time, when she parted her lips, instead of speaking and telling him of the horrendous atrocities she'd committed in the name of the pack, she leaned forward and planted them squarely on his. Chapter 8. Michael. Where the hell had that come from? He certainly hadn't intended giving Freya the wrong impression. He'd been attempting to be totally professional, efficient. But his question to her about what was the worst thing about being a werewolf had shifted the atmosphere. The way her bottom lip disappeared under her top teeth, and how her eyes had lifted up as though she was trying to push away unhappy memories. When that tear had started weaving its way down her cheek, the impulse to wipe it away had been overwhelming. What he hadn't expected was for a moment later her lips to land on his. He also hadn't expected the urge to kiss her back to take him over with such ferocity. Heat from her body pulsed through him. Her hands were on his, on the small of his back, then at the front, fiddling with his buttons. First the top one, then the second. There was no waiting for the third. He lifted his arms and let her pull the shirt over his head. Then it was his turn. His hands on her body, his fingertips against her skin, her arms above her head. Shaking his head, he stepped back, his heart pounding beneath his ribs. No, we can't do this. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I shouldn't. I can't. This is... She stepped forward and took him by the hand and moved it down to the buttons on her jeans, her eyes fixed on his. This is exactly what we both need, she said. Freya. Lying in the bed, she laughed at the absurdity of the situation. As bizarre as it was probably one of the few acts she'd managed in the last few years that her mother would have been proud of. Future alphas were meant to mate outside the pack, to keep the gene pool as wide as possible. And it had been one hell of a mating. Sweat had beaded on his chest and across his shoulders. He was scrawnier than the men in the compound, less muscular, paler, yet that hadn't mattered. What did matter was that, for a while there, she was able to block it all out. The memories of the screaming and begging, the wide eyes filled with terror, the tears and the pleading. All of it was banished, as she focused on the way his body moved, the way his fingers felt against her skin. You're thinking that was a mistake, aren't you? Michael's words brought her back to the room. This was a bad idea. You're right, you're completely right. I should go. Flushing pink, he shifted over to the edge of the bed. But before he could manage to sit upright, Freya was pushing him back down again. "I wasn't thinking this was a mistake," she said. "You weren't? Were you?" A half shrug and shake of the head. "Well, it's probably not my most professional moment ever." "Funny, I was thinking the exact opposite." His eyes narrowed on hers, the confusion caused by her statement clear on his face. Given how hard he had worked over the last hour, she probably owed him something. "Future alphas are meant to mate outside the pack," she said. "Bring new blood into the line." "Mate, you mean—" He sprang back up, all the colour now draining from his cheeks. "You mean that's what this was?" For what felt like the first time in forever, Freya laughed. "Wow, seriously, you are highly strung." She pushed him back down once more, unable to remove the grin from her face. "Don't worry, we're good. I just meant in general, that's all." Phew. He relaxed again, the colour returning to his cheeks in a sudden rush. For a couple of minutes they lay there together, staring up at the ceiling in silence. She'd been with plenty of men before. When you grow up living in a compound where people habitually got naked, things happen. Normally in the forest. She couldn't remember doing this, though, just lying, thinking. "So you never knew your father?" Michael broke her thoughts for the second time in as many minutes. He rolled over onto his side to face her. "Not at all." "I don't even know who he is. She has a couple of ideas, a few men she thinks it could be." Once again, his face paled. He was like a traffic light system, she thought, but with just two colours, red and white. She found herself chuckling. The men in the pack were so damn cocksure, with an air of superiority that often didn't live up to the promise. Lying here with him like this was different. Refreshing. "Is that it? Is that the worst thing about being a wolf?" "Oh, not even close." This time, his expression was one of genuine concern, a thick crease between his eyebrows. "I'm sorry," he said. "Whatever it is, whatever you had to go through, I'm sorry." Such simple words, such a simple sentiment, and yet no one in the pack had ever said that to her. Not that they knew all the details. No one except her mother and Whipper knew those. But they knew enough, and even Chrissy hadn't managed to say the words. When Freya had returned from that trip, mute from all she'd seen and done, Chrissy had come and taken her by the hand and led her to the bathroom, where she'd wiped the remaining bloodstains from her hands and mouth. But she hadn't said she was sorry. After all, had to be done, for the good of the pack. "Do you want to get out of here?" Freya asked, slipping from under his arms and onto the floor, where she picked up her jeans. "I was meant to show you around. Come on, time to see some of the good bits of being a wolf." "To be honest, I think I'd rather see the good bits you've already shown me again." And at that she stopped, kicked her jeans from around her ankles, and leapt back onto the bed. Chapter 9. Freya. Only when they finally stepped outside and saw the sky in all its shades of purple and pink did she realize evening was already upon them. "I guess time flies when you're having fun." He grinned at her, and butterflies swarmed in her stomach. A strange sensation was tingling through her fingers, giving her the urge to reach over and wrap them around his, to hold hands. Rejecting such sentimentality, she shoved her hands deep into her pockets. She didn't do holding hands. "So what are you going to show me?" Michael asked. He was keeping a 2-foot distance from her, as if that would disguise the fact that they had spent the last few hours writhing around naked in his bed. "There were some buildings I noticed on the way in, large ones. I was wondering what they were for." "Actually, I thought we could go for a walk." "A walk?" "It's a pretty special night." This was the first time she could remember not spending the full moon as a wolf. Of course, there were several hours to go, and hopefully she could get in a bit of a run later. Several members of the pack were already out, getting prepared, others still inside, probably eating family meals before leaving the children for the night. "So is this a big event?" he asked as they walked. "I thought I read somewhere that the moon isn't actually significant." "The moon has nothing to do with us turning. That doesn't mean it isn't significant." "So it is." "Well, according to the stories, the first time Eve, the first werewolf, turned was under a full moon. Of course, according to those stories, Eve was also in a dungeon the first time she turned, so how she would have even known it was a full moon, I have no idea. You have to try not to analyze these myths too much, or they tend to fall apart. Sounds familiar. Evening birdsong filled the air, and dappled clouds were sweeping across the sky, in shades of burnt umber and magenta. For some reason, even with these clouds, the moon seemed brighter than usual. Where are we heading now? He asked. Depends how fast you walk. There's a clearing a couple of miles in. If we don't get that far, there are a couple of other places en route. We need to be off the tracks by the time the wolves start running. After brief consideration, she picked a path that stayed completely clear of their main routes. She knew what it could be like, how easy it was to get swept away with the fever of the pack when they were racing under a full moon. The last thing she had wanted was for him to get flattened when he was supposed to be under her watch. For the first part of the walk, he was quiet, visibly concentrating on his feet as he stepped over tree roots and around undergrowth. Enjoying the silence of his company, she led on, deeper and deeper into the forest. Above them, the clouds began to disperse, and the moon grew brighter and brighter in its fullness. Thank you. Michael started up the conversation again, as he strode over a small stream. For what? For this. For showing me what it's like to be part of the pack. That was my job, remember? What I was told to do. Still, thank you. He walked for a few moments longer before he spoke again. I know you said you sometimes have people coming to the compound, but I assume you go out too. The cars look new. You must need to get supplies in. We do. People leave for things. Spend some time in the city too. And you? What about you? Do you ever leave? Her stomach sank. It hadn't taken long for reality to kick back in, for the realization that this romantic, moonlit stroll was as far from her reality as she was ever going to get. How could she explain to him? She couldn't. That was the truth of the matter. The way he'd looked at her that afternoon. He would never look at her like that again. Not if he knew. Fighting down the anger that was building inside her, she upped her pace. Freya, don't do that, he said, stumbling over tangles of roots and broken branches as he tried to keep up. Do what? You can talk to me. No, I can't. I get it. It's because you're meant to be the alpha, right? You think you're not good enough? We all feel that way sometimes. Everyone feels like they don't fit in now and then. Sorry. I mean, whatever it is you don't feel you can tell anyone. You can tell me anything. Stopping in her tracks, she twisted around and looked him square in the eye. You think just because we spent a couple of hours screwing, you know me? You think that because you're happy to share about your freakish family upbringing, I should do the same? You don't know anything about me. And trust me, that's the way it's going to stay. Michael. Given how quickly the mood had changed, it took him a moment to catch up as he suddenly realized that his guide, and the only one who had any idea where the hell he was in the middle of this forest, was marching off into the distance. Freya. He tripped and stumbled on more undergrowth as he struggled to catch up with her. Freya, wait, look. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. Her silhouette was shrinking in the distance. If he lost sight of her, he'd had it. Please, slow down. Please, I'm sorry. I really am sorry. By normal Blackwatch training standards, he was pretty fit. Compared to Freya, however, he was seriously lacking. 4 minutes of trying to follow her through the maze of trees, and he was struggling. He'd caught his trousers so many times the hems were trailing, and the humidity, combined with all the mosquitoes and other bugs, was causing him to sweat and blink at a rate that was bound to see him go flying any second. Please, wait. Finally, she slowed her pace, before drawing to a stop and turning around. I know that maybe I blurred the lines a bit earlier, but you're here to ask questions about the pack, not ask stuff about me personally. Is that clear? She spat every word at him. I'm sorry, I am. It just didn't make sense to me, that's all. You came across as so fearless, so smart. Her glare had failed to soften by even a fraction. I'll just stop talking now. Clamping his mouth closed, he waited for her reply. If he'd learned anything about her in the last 12 hours, it was that she wasn't going to give away anything about herself that she didn't want to. He had pushed things too far. I'll only ask questions about the pack from now on, he assured her. General stuff. Is that fair? Fine, but if I don't like something you ask, I'm not answering it. I understand. Moving forward, and substantially surer-footed than he had been when attempting to run, he struggled to think of a suitably safe question to break the silence. There'd been a couple more things he wanted to ask, but they both felt a bit too close to the previous topic to risk. So, for the time being, he decided it was better just to walk in silence. Country living had never been something that particularly appealed to him. It was too inconvenient. Living in London, for as long as he had, he couldn't even imagine not having everything he wanted on his doorstep. When this trip was over, there would probably be a couple of weeks of write-ups and presentations before he was sent on his next placement. Of course, there was a chance he could be reassigned to somewhere in the sticks. There were a few vampires in Cornwall, not to mention a whole load of them in North Wales, but most of Blackwatch's work was in the cities. Vampires needed humans, after all. The only real chance you had of ending up in the middle of nowhere was if you wanted to go there, which he didn't. Or if you messed up big time, which he didn't plan on doing. Even so, this place had more appeal than he'd expected. The birdsong was so much clearer and more varied than he'd ever experienced in London. Spring had passed, and they were well into summer, and the whole of the forest floor was alive with colour, and he was seeing just a small fraction, of course. He couldn't imagine what it would be like for the wolves, who knew every inch of it, and with their heightened senses. "Do you eat as a wolf?" he asked, finally hitting on a question that he was pretty sure had no personal implications. "I mean, I know you eat as a human, but can you eat as a wolf too?" She didn't even bother to break her stride or look at him, and she started to answer. "We can eat as a wolf, but when we change back, our digestive system changes with us." "What does that mean?" "It means that when we eat a piece of chicken as a human and change into a wolf, it's not a problem, because a wolf's stomach is designed to eat stuff like that. But the other way round, and you, say, eat a whole rabbit, fur and bones and all, when you're a wolf and then change back to a human, well, it ain't going to be particularly pleasant for you. We've developed stronger digestive systems than the average person, obviously, but it's still not something I'd recommend doing too often." "So you don't eat as a wolf, then?" "Not unless we're spending most of our time as a wolf, for some reason, living as one." "And you do that sometimes? I mean, werewolves in general. Other werewolves, I wasn't trying to ask about you in particular." Her face softened. "Some wolves do. We have a few members of the pack who prefer to spend the majority of their time out here as wolves. They live in these forests almost permanently and only come back when the alpha tells them they have to. I've done a couple of months here and there when I first turned. The more you stay as a wolf, the better you get at it. Like blocking others out, that's when I learned to do it." Given that she'd been the one to shift back to the personal, he was starting to feel a little more confident in this line of questioning. "How does that work? The voices in your head. How do you hear them?" "At first, it's complete chaos. After the ceremony, well, I can't even start to explain how horrendous it is. Everyone is instructed not to change for the first couple of weeks. It gives the new wolves time to adapt in peace, to learn about themselves, to talk amongst themselves. Then the alpha and some of the others gradually turn back. It's another reason ceremonies don't take place every year. It's time-consuming and a lot of pressure on the pack." They had slowed to a pace little more than a gentle stroll. "So the alpha, she's always there in your head? How do you hear her if everyone else is talking too?" "Oh, you hear her all right, unless she doesn't want you to. She can make any conversation she wants private. Like the betas too, I assume." "Mostly." A slight smirk flickered on her lips, and he got the impression that there was far more to that single word than it gave away. Still, he skipped over that and kept the conversation on track. "I imagine it's a bit like being in a canteen. Do you know what a canteen is?" He remembered that she'd never been away from home before. "It's a massive eating hall. They have them in schools and factories and places. They're always full of people and noises." "I know what a canteen is, dumbass," she said, slapping him on the shoulder. "I've never thought of it like that before, though, but I guess you're right. You just have to find the people you want to talk to and block out everything else that's going on around you." "But you can't ignore everyone, right? Isn't that the whole point?" "Sort of. I mean, it depends how good you are at it. I don't have to listen to all the rubbish anymore, just my mother. And the betas too. like you said," she added as an afterthought. They were getting close to being personal again, and he did not want to land himself back in her bad books. But at the same time, she'd been the one hovering around the topic for the last few minutes. It seemed like the right moment to ask. "What's it like when she orders you? When you have to do the things she tells you to?" Freya stopped walking again. Sighing, she leaned against a tree trunk. "I can't imagine it any other way. It's just how it is. Think of it like a megaphone going off in your mind. It consumes you. You don't want to focus on anything else. You can't focus on anything else." "What about now? Can't be that strong when she's not here." "When you're far away from her, you still know when she's contacting you. It's not clear enough to pick up the details, but you can feel it. You can sense what she's telling you. That probably sounds ridiculous. I know it must." "No, I understand. At least, I think I do." Her eyes were gazing out into the forest, and Michael found himself consumed with the urge to tilt her head towards him and kiss her again. As if reading his thoughts, she shifted her position. Heart pounding, he stepped forward, only to be startled back again. The howl that pierced the night air was unlike anything he'd ever heard before. Loud and sonorous, it sang out into the sky. Every bird took flight. Even the grass at his feet seemed to ripple in response. The sound had barely begun to fade when the next one started. And then the next. And the next. Soon the whole forest was alive, reverberating in a way that caused every hair on his body to rise up. He looked for signs of life in the darkness as the wind billowed around him, sending a cloud of leaves spiraling up and into the air. With the world singing, he lost himself in the music. How long passed he couldn't have said, but when the howling finally faded, the air felt warm around him. Wow. Beside him, Freya nodded wordlessly. She had transformed not into a wolf, but into something almost ethereal, as if she were glowing from the inside. You know, it's the first time I've heard it like that since I was a kid. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. He was caught in her wistful look, the way her eyes seemed lost in the past. Then, in an instant, the look and the glow were gone. "You must be the first outsider to have heard that from inside the forest in over 100 years, she said. "Thank you," he replied, although the words didn't seem enough for what he just experienced. "Thank you for showing me this, for sharing it with me." In that moment, something shifted, something that made him feel like his world was never going to be the same again. This time he took the lead. Stepping forward, he slipped his hands around her waist, pulled her in, and kissed her like he'd never kissed anyone before. Chapter 10. Michael. He couldn't sleep. Somehow the night managed to be too quiet and too noisy at the same time. Crickets, toads, and owls, and all the sounds that weren't normal for nighttime in the city pervaded his senses. Besides, he wanted to make this last. To remember her like this, asleep and at peace, her face displaying none of the worry that was normally etched there, her mind no longer filled with whatever burdens it usually carried. Lifting his hand, he drew a fingertip across her temples. He hadn't actually fallen for her, had he? He asked himself, as a squirming sensation twisted in his stomach. He couldn't have. He'd spent less than a day with her. And she was a werewolf. The exact thing he had come to study. Maybe that was the reason his head was so filled with her, watching her sleep like a weird stalker. From outside came another howl. Some of them were still out, enjoying the last pale light of the full moon. Closing his eyes, he sank back down onto the pillow next to her. Hopefully, Jessup was getting more of the factual stuff they needed. He didn't feel his remaining days here were going to be as productive as he had planned. Freya. She was roused by the smell, sweet and warm, and coming from inside her cabin. Memories of the night before brought a smile to her face. Rolling over, she stretched her arm out across the bed, only to find it empty. "I thought you might be hungry." Blinking, she twisted around to see Michael on the other side of the cabin in the kitchen area. In his hand was a frying pan she didn't even know he owned. "I made breakfast," he said with a grin. Butterflies swarmed once more. No one had ever done that for her. Not in a situation like this, anyway. "I should probably ring Jessup today," he said, bringing over a plate stacked with pancakes. "See how he and your mother are getting on with the others." "Thank you," she said, taking one from the top. "And what are you going to tell him about how you're getting on here?" "Well," he bit down on the corner of his lip, "I think I'll say that I've been building an excellent relationship between Blackwatch and the pack." "You have you?" "I believe I have. I think I've really started to understand their needs." "Oh, I think you're managing that." "I mean, I'm fairly sure that with a little more time, we can make an extremely satisfying partnership." He was leaning over her, grinning. The warmth that had been spreading through her was now a full-blown heat, causing her heart to thump against her ribs. "You think I'm satisfied with the situation, do you?" she asked, trying to disguise the breathiness that was creeping into her voice. "If you're not, then that's something I feel I should rectify straight away." He took the pancake back from her and placed the plate on the bedside table. "Hey, I was going to eat that. They'll get cold," she protested. "I can cook more." Michael. On a professional level, he'd been screwed from the first, screw. There was no backing out now. Besides, he was certain Freya wasn't going to say anything. While he may not yet know as much about pack dynamics as he planned to, he felt he got a pretty good feel for her. If need be, he'd ask her to just write down a list of facts he could pass on to Jessup. "I was thinking," he said, stroking her arm as he spoke, "there seem to be more women in the pack than men." "There are." "Why is that?" "You really know nothing about werewolf genealogy, do you?" The words weren't said maliciously, but she looked perplexed. "I studied the files of Blackwatch. I know some stuff, like about the telepathy." "Wow, you've read loads." "That's why I'm here, remember? I was meant to see more of the compound than just your bedroom." She smiled. "So, back to the women. Why were there more out there than men when you all came to greet us?" Freya. Freya took a deep breath. The subject was a touchy one for the women of the pack, but that couldn't be helped. Her mother wanted him to learn about them, and it wasn't like it was something they could change, even if it was something no one wanted to shout about. In a nutshell, women were the alphas, the strongest, the most feared of all the wolves, and the men got the easier ride. "The werewolf gene is passed down through the mother, whether she's transformed or not," she started. "Any child she has will have the werewolf gene, and there's nothing she can do about it." "Meaning?" "Meaning that if a woman gets pregnant, then it's there. It doesn't matter whether she has a boy or a girl, that baby's got werewolf in it." "But it doesn't mean she's more likely to have a girl." "No." "So why are there fewer males?" Such a clueless man. "Because men can leave. They can make the decision not to go through with the ceremony and remain human. They can go away and start regular families. They don't carry the gene. Their children on the outside will be normal. But if a woman leaves, pretends to be normal and starts a family..." "But you said there's a ceremony. The wolf gene needs to be activated, right? It just can't happen by accident, can it? She can still live a normal human life." His naivety was somehow heartwarming and heart-wrenching at the same time. It ran deep, as if optimism was ingrained in him. "How many vampires are there out there now?" She tried coming at it from a different angle. "Vampires? Why?" "Because vampires are what activate the gene. We need to be scratched by a vampire." "You do?" His jaw hung open. Clearly this was yet another piece of information his precious Blackwatch had skipped telling him. Given that they were meant to keep tabs on the vampire population, it didn't feel like they could be doing such a great job. Still, she didn't want to labor the point. Blackwatch problems were his to deal with. She already had enough of her own. Any female who leaves the pack does so with the risk that she, or any of her children, could become activated on the outside. It took a moment for a reply to come. "Just because there are vampires doesn't mean they go around scratching people." "Oh, I know the whole vampires can be good guys line, and from what you've told me, I believe they can be. Some. But that doesn't mean they don't ever lose control. All of us do from time to time. But the difference is, if that happens to a vampire and the person they're angry with has the werewolf gene, then in one slip, their whole life would be turned upside down. If you knew you had the gene, maybe you could be extra careful, but if you didn't, any female who tries to make a life outside the pack has to shoulder that burden for her whole life. And we're not just talking about her, but her children and grandchildren and their children and so on the female side. Any could fall victim just because she wanted to break free. Can you imagine what that would do to you? What that responsibility would be like? That's why there are more women in the pack, because men can escape, but no matter what we do, activated or not, we women are trapped. So we might as well be trapped here, as werewolves. The enormity of what she had told him slowly dawned on him, and the silence that followed was not a comfortable one. He straightened his back, sitting up in the bed, shifting away from her. It was a reaction she knew all too well. Rejection. Anger now burned in her chest. She was stupid for thinking that with her mother gone, she could let her guard down. Swallowing back tears she had no intention of allowing to fall, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. When Michael caught her by the hand. "Come with me," he said. "We can leave. Now. You can escape all of this. Please, Freya. Do this. Run away with me." Chapter 11. Michael. He didn't know where the word had come from, and by the look of shock on her face, it may not have been the wisest thing to say, but he didn't care. He didn't want to take them back. "You can have a life, Freya, whatever life you want. You are not bound to the pack." "My mother is the Alpha," she replied, as if that was the only answer that was needed. "And I'm part of Blackwatch. We keep vampires hidden, remember? One more woman would be nothing." She arched an eyebrow as she huffed. "And Blackwatch would be willing to hide me." Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he tilted her chin to face him. "Blackwatch wouldn't need to know anything about you. It would just be me. I'd take a job in the sticks, North Wales, or somewhere there's plenty of forest. You could still be a wolf if you wanted to. Or not. Not at all, or we could live in a city. Whatever you wanted. But you don't have to stay here. You don't have to feel like this is your only choice. It's not. You don't have to be the Alpha, and you don't have to stay in the pack. You have a choice here, Freya." This time he didn't move to wipe away her tears. He knew that the fact they were falling was probably causing her enough distress. "You don't know," she said, her voice half whisper, half croak. "I don't know what?" "You don't know what I've done." Freya. It was the kind thing to do, the best way to break it off. Once he knew what she'd done, he'd be gone, out the door without a second glance, thanking his lucky stars for his escape. "Whatever you've done, whatever the pack made you do, it doesn't change how I feel about you, Freya." She laughed bitterly. He'd asked for it. "There was a wolf," she started. "A woman. She'd grown up in the compound. It was the only life she'd ever known, just like me. Although she was a couple of years older than I am now. Was." The word echoed in her head. Past tense. There was no coming back from that. "So what happened?" he asked. "She was smart, beautiful, fun. She was amazing, an incredible wolf. Then it happened. She met someone. She fell in love." "You're not allowed to fall in love? I don't understand. I thought I saw people here on that first night. Couples. They seem close." "Oh, they are." Pressing her lips together, she tried to find a way to word something she'd spent her whole life trying to get her head around. "We can't transform people into werewolves. It's not like being a vampire. You either have the werewolf gene or you don't. All this nonsense you see in films, it's just not true." "What does this have to do with the woman?" "I'm getting there." She nodded slowly, reassuring herself as much as him. "I said before women got the short straw, right? We cannot leave the pack. You can't fall in love with someone outside the pack. So this werewolf, she fell in love outside the pack? She'd been meeting someone, a hiker. She was in the woods one day and this woman was there. They got talking and one thing led to another. After that, they continued to meet in secret." "What happened?" What always happens when a problem arises in the pack. It was dealt with. From outside came the howl of a single wolf, causing a shiver to run through her. Chrissy. She'd recognize that howl anywhere. She was probably wondering why she hadn't seen Freya for so long, or the Blackwatch guy for that matter. Her name was Jessica. Her parents are still in the pack, even after everything. Maybe it would have been better if she'd come clean, but she didn't. She tried to hide it from us. From my mother, and for a while, she succeeded. I thought that wasn't possible. I thought every werewolf was connected to the pack and to the alpha. The colour had drained from his cheeks, and she could tell he already suspected where this story was leading. But he didn't know all of it, and she needed to tell him. That's what the others choose to think. It's understandable. I guess the truth would scare them too much. Why? What would the truth be? That only a wolf who is stronger than the alpha would be able to block her out permanently. And a wolf that is stronger than the alpha is a threat to the whole pack. She watched, as goosebumps spread across his bare arms. So this wolf, Jessica, the one the one we hunted. Hunted? One night her girlfriend brought a truck and met her on the edge of the forest. They ran away together. What made it worse was Jessica had shared what she was with this woman. We were all at risk. So how'd you find them? Did Jessica turn back to a wolf? Just the once, but that was enough. My mother locked onto her, ordered her to stay as she was so we could hunt her down. But Jessica fought it. Probably the biggest testament to love I've ever known. The fact she fought my mother's command so that she could transform back and tell her lover to run. And what happened? What happened? As she approached the end of her story, Freya was surprised to find herself calmer than she would have expected. Maybe it was Michael's presence, or perhaps she was finally making her peace with what had ensued. No, that would never be the case. It took everything she had, all her strength, to block us out for just a few hours. By the time we caught up with her, she was no threat to anyone. Fighting off my mother's call had nearly killed her. So what did you do? From outside, voices rose, and several howls punctuated the quiet. A midday run. How had so much of the day gone already? In the quiet, Michael's question remained hanging in the air. He didn't need an answer. She could see it on his face. He already knew. It wasn't the whole pack, just my mother and Whipper, and me. We were the ones who hunted them down. I was tasked with them both, Jessica and the woman she'd fallen in love with. I managed the wolf. My mother had forced her to transform back again so that when she was killed, it was wolf on wolf. But the human, I couldn't manage the human. She'd done nothing wrong except fall in love. She was terrified, and she wouldn't have told anyone about us. I know she wouldn't. So I couldn't do it. And Whipper, well, forget all that for the good of the pack bullshit. It was cold-blooded, calculated butchery, plain and simple. I think that's maybe why I can block her out. She's not a beta to me anymore. She's nothing more than a murderer. What happened after that? After that, I stayed human for a year. More, maybe. I don't remember now. I lost track of time. I just knew I couldn't transform again. Into that monster. Her head was against his chest. She hadn't noticed when this had happened, when she'd slipped into his arms and pushed herself against his skin. But she needed it so much. His warmth. His strength. So why do you ever change back? Why didn't you just stay human, start a new life outside the pack? Where? With whom? I was 14. I was a screw-up. And I'd taken the exact same vows as Jessica. I wasn't going to put myself through what we did to her. You know, people say that images fade with time, that you forget stuff. But that only happens with the good things, not the bad. I remember every single second of it. That's why I can't be the alpha and make those decisions. I won't. So I'm trapped. And now I think I've done the same thing as Jessica. I think I've fallen for someone outside the pack. And I don't know how we're going to solve this. Chapter 12. Freya. There was no way anyone could find out. They could have their suspicions, of course, but Freya letting anything slip, even to Chrissy, would make the knowledge accessible to the whole pack. It was enough having Michael putting himself in such danger. She couldn't do the same to Chrissy, too. So they spent the rest of the afternoon putting together as crude and rudimentary a plan as she had ever known. First thing on the list was for Michael to ring Jessup. When he learned that he and Lena were planning on spending one more day with the South Pack, that left them 2 days to get themselves sorted. The main problem was transport. If she had left stowed away in the boot of Michael and Jessup's car, her mother would likely join the dots together almost immediately. The last thing she needed to do was draw her a complete map. If she ran away as a wolf, they would smell her. The same applied to going on foot as a human. So what they needed was a way to leave separately and mask her scent from the other wolves. It'll work. You can say we spent the last 2 days going over the fundamentals, history, the splitting off of the South Pack, hierarchy, the ceremony. There are books I can get you to read up on tonight which will help. Then the next 2 days you'll spend with the pack. I'll appoint Chrissy as your guide to take you around to different families. I'll say I need to do some proper running, that I'm fed up being tied to you the whole time. You want me to tie you up? That's not something I'm normally into, but hey, I'll give it a go. He grinned, his eyes glinting with mischief. As much as she wanted to reciprocate, she couldn't. There was too much at stake. Still, she appreciated his attempt to lighten the mood. I'll have to walk the bags up tonight, she continued, talking half to herself and half to Michael. Carrying things as wolves never works well. I must make sure I'm not spotted, though. Can I help with that? Not really, it would be too suspicious. Besides, I'm going to need you for something else. So once the bag is done, tomorrow, I'll go into the forest as a wolf. They need to be able to trace my scent easily. There's this place, a ravine. We lost a wolf there a couple of years ago when he decided to change after a drinking session. It's pretty dangerous. I'll go there. Then I'll need to cover my scent. There's some good flowers I could try. It's not going to be perfect, but better than nothing. Then it'll be a full day walking, as a human. I should be able to hit 30 miles easily. Thinking about it a bit more, she lowered her estimate. Let's say 20. Rising, she moved across to the shelves, from where she pulled down a map, and came back and spread it out on the bed. Her eyes searched for a location that would work. Here, she said, tapping the page. Here is where you meet me. Right on the edge of the pack's boundaries. She'd found it. A narrow track, but one a car could travel down. The same one where Jessica's girlfriend had been waiting. She circled the spot with her finger several times, making sure he could see exactly where she meant. That was it. That was everything decided, or at least everything she was going to tell him about. With her throat drying by the second, she turned her attention from the map and looked him straight in the eye. Are you sure? If we start this now, that's it. There's no backing out. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, he said, kissing her on the lips. Okay, so this is how you're going to help me. Michael. For Michael, speaking in front of large crowds was up there with root canal treatment and long journeys on public buses. If at all possible, he would avoid it at all costs. Unfortunately, just like dental work and crowded communal transport, it was sometimes necessary. And this was one of those times. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here today. His voice was hoarse, and with his current pulse rate, he felt he was no more than a few minutes away from cardiac arrest. But this is what Freya said would work, so this was what he was doing. For the last few days, I've been learning about your heritage and history, with the gracious guidance of Freya. He offered a nod and a smile to where she stood, at the back of the room. As expected, all heads turned to note her typically scowling reaction. It was strange seeing her like this again. He'd almost forgotten that hard glare of disapproval, which had been a permanent fixture on her face when he had arrived. Now that they had all seen her there, it was time to attract attention away from her. Tomorrow I'm going to be meeting some of you on a more individual basis, but I'd like to know if you have any questions about Blackwatch, about what we're currently doing and what our aims are for the future. If there's anything that you'd like me to feed back to my superiors. Just as Freya had expected, the hall erupted into a ruckus of questions coming at him from every quarter. It wasn't surprising. Only 120 years ago, the wolves had been hunted by Blackwatch, at the behest of the vampires. It was no wonder they had questions, or that they were angry. All he had to do was to keep it bubbling long enough for Freya to get to the ridge and back. 2 hours running time. That's what she said it would take. So, taking a deep breath, he watched as she slipped out the back door, and then turned his attention to a woman with silver-white hair, standing in front of him. What I want to know is how they're going to compensate us for the years they kept us captive. He took another deep breath. Only 1 hour, 59 minutes to go. Chapter 13. Michael. When he returned to his cabin, Freya was waiting there. So you managed it then? She asked. Without a word, he flopped out onto the bed and groaned. The whole thing had lasted close to 3 hours, most of it going around in circles. You know you gave me over to the firing squad, he asked. Pretty much, she said, the smallest hint of a smirk on her lips. You think I've been in charge back in the 1800s the way they attacked me? I'll tell you what, though, it's making me look at Blackwatch in another light. Although, I guess that was half your aim too. Again, the smirk was there. It had been an eye-opener, that was for sure. All he'd ever heard in Blackwatch training was how they were the peacekeepers, the ones who guarded the line between the human and paranormal worlds, who prevented the two halves meeting and the chaos that would ensue. When Blackwatch spoke of the wolves, there was a cursory acknowledgement of what had happened, just a small black mark on their reputation. But the way the wolves told of all the injustice they had suffered, it was more like they had spilled the whole damned inkwell. When he got back, he would make the real situation known. Did you get the bag where you wanted it? He asked. Don't forget, I can get you anything you need once we're safe. It was just some clothes and a few essentials, she said, although he could swear she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Freya. Everything was ready. All she had to do was see it through, as planned, but it was going to be a little less straightforward than she'd let on to him. She kissed him goodbye in the cabin before taking him, in her usual gruff manner, to Chrissy, so that her friend could act as his tour guide for the next day and a half. Leaving him without the slightest acknowledgement, she was on her own. The problem was her scent. The wolves would be able to track her. The only way they believed that she'd met with an accident would be if there was evidence of it. The most common place that wolves got into trouble was on the hunt. It took over half an hour, padding through the forest in her wolf form, to pinpoint what she was after. A deer. A stag. By its smell, it was a young one, but still big enough to do the trick. What's more, it was wonderfully close to the bag of essentials that she'd left the night before. So far, it was all going as well as she could have hoped for, although locating a deer was the easy part. It was the rest that was worrying her. Some of the pack loved hunting, lived for it, the chase and the adrenaline, the kill, but not Freya. She'd seen the light fade from another creature's eyes, seen the despair in them, the desperate hope that she might change her mind and relent. She'd sworn she'd never repeat that, but right now she knew what she had to do. One last time. She couldn't stay, not now she knew there could be a life for her out there, away from the rules of the pack and the demands of the alpha. Since that day with Jessica, she had known that she could never again be the one to decide who got to live or die. If she stayed, that's exactly what she would have to be prepared to do. The stag had his head lowered when she reached him. With his nose down, she could hear him chewing away. His antlers brushed against the grass. She padded forward, his scent almost overwhelming. It was strange how easy she found stalking, how instinctive. A twig cracked in the distance, and the stag's head sprang up in alarm. Her pulse rocketed in response. No doubt another animal. A rabbit. A squirrel, even. Focus. That's what mattered now. She could do this. She could bring him down easily, swiftly. He would barely know what had happened. She would make it look like a struggle later. Her pulse pounded. She could see the veins bulging along his rippling muscles, his life blood flowing through them. A life that she was about to extinguish. One death. That was all. One deer. No human. No Jessica this time. Her movements were instinctive. Springing off her back leg, she launched herself into the air. Her teeth sank into the neck of the creature, piercing his skin with a popping sound. Next she felt the muscle, and the severing of the artery as she bit deep. He kicked back, but her teeth were already locked in place. The taste of blood filled her mouth, warm and metallic. It had been the same with Jessica. The distraction of that thought cost her. The stag kicked again and twisted, loosening her grip. Something sharp dug into her ribs. An antler, maybe. She didn't have time to think about it. She sunk her teeth in deeper and shifted herself up so her full weight bore down on the stag. With all the force she possessed, she twisted her head back and forth. The stench of blood and sweat filled her nostrils as his writhing snorts grew weaker and weaker. She held on, feeling his strength ebbing and the pulse became fainter. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Only when there was no hint of life left did she let go and back away. Given the circumstances, it was as clean a death as she could have hoped for. But that wasn't all she needed. With the creature now lying sightless in front of her, she had no compunction about what she did next. Still in wolf form, she locked her jaw around the stag's neck and tore away a chunk of flesh. With her claws, she ripped another from his stomach, and then went to work on his hide, ripping away part of his tail in the process. Content with the job well done, she gave her handiwork one more check before changing back into her human form. The chill on her skin was amplified by the sight in front of her. It had been dead, of that there was no doubt, but the glazed, unfocused eyes, the jaw hanging at an unnatural angle, turned her stomach. The deer was well and truly convincing now. Another job ticked off the list. There was only one thing left to do. Taking another step back, she winced and glanced down at her ribs. A fresh bruise was already flowering in hues of red, blue, and purple. A kick like that was going to hurt for a few days. But that wouldn't be enough. Bruising didn't leave a scent trail. Turning around, she walked a few feet over to the tree where her rucksack was hidden, and, steeling herself against the pain, she reached up and pulled it down. She'd packed sparingly. 1 pair of jeans, 2 tops, and 1 pair of trainers was all there was in the way of clothes. The rest of the bag was filled with medical supplies and a freshly sharpened knife. Selecting the knife, alcohol, needle, thread, and a wide bandage, she stuffed the rest back inside. She took a long, deep breath. Okay, you can do this. You can. Grasping the knife, 100 thoughts whirred through her mind, none of them positive. Nerves that had been bubbling away inside her all morning were now strong enough to make her feel nauseous. After this, there would be no going back. Ever. This would be a huge risk, but it came with the chance of an amazing prize. The chance of a new life. A choice. Neither of those was available to her if she stayed here. Her first job was to sterilize the knife. She unscrewed the bottle of alcohol and poured some over the blade. Her hand was steady now as she watched the clear liquid run off onto the earth below. She'd only brought 1 bottle and needed to be sparing with it. This wasn't going to be the only time she'd need it. Content that it was as clean as it could be, she screwed the lid back on the bottle and placed it down by her feet. The next task had been the one that had kept her awake all night. Holding the knife above her bare skin, she breathed in and clenched her jaw. It needed to be precise. Clean. Something she could stitch up easily after expelling enough blood to make a trail. She hesitated. Lowering it again, she moved over to a tree and snapped off a small branch, which she put between her teeth, ready to bite down on. Here goes, she said to herself. Pinching a fold of skin at her waist and pulling it away from her body. She looked away as the knife tore through her flesh. Rather than biting down on the stick as she had intended, she gasped, dropping it to the ground. She looked down at the blood pouring from her side. It was a deep but neat cut, easy to sew back together when she was finished with her plan. She turned and froze. Well, isn't this interesting? Chapter 14. Freya. The blood flow was steady, streaming rather than gushing, exactly as Freya had intended. What she hadn't banked on, though, was having an audience. And of all the people in the pack, it didn't get worse than this. "Whipper," she said. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" Her eyebrow arched. I think the question is, what are you doing? Taking down a stag, making it look like there was a struggle, now stabbing yourself. I have to say, Freya, that looks painful. Why don't you sit down? Freya glanced at her side. Blood pooled between her fingers as she attempted to stem the flow. A lightheadedness was starting to muddle her thoughts, although it had nothing to do with the blood loss. Just go, Whipper. Just pretend you didn't see me. Why? Why would I want to do that? She began to move, circling around Freya, her lips curled upwards in a sneer. For years I've been telling your mother to cut you loose. It's funny, isn't it? Lena, despite all her objective ruthlessness, still can't recognise her blind spot when it comes to you. I guess it's a maternal thing. I could tell straight away you were never made to lead a pack, and the way you acted in that whole Jessica debacle. Well, I have to say, falling for the Blackwatch boy. That I didn't anticipate. I don't know what you're on about. Really? I'm looking forward to the look on his face when I return to the village with your blood on my hands. After all, you're a traitor. Then again, so is he. You stay away from him! Freya could feel her pulse pounding. The wet heat of the blood had spread down her thighs. You said it! Cut me loose! Just let me go! Pretend you never saw me! We'll both be happy! Whipper's sneer was full on now. Oh, but that's not what I'm after. And you've just given me the perfect opportunity to get what I really want. Even without their connection, Freya knew exactly what Whipper's next move was going to be, and she was ready for it. The pair changed at the exact same instant. Fur gleamed and rippled in the wind. The knife dropped to the ground where only a heartbeat ago Freya had been standing as a human. Whipper snarled. Hackles raised as she leapt into the air. In any normal circumstance, Freya would have sprung forwards too and met her mid-leap. But this wasn't normal. The transformation had split her wound even further. Blood was now spilling from her side. Fighting the pain, she ducked as Whipper flew at her. That's your plan, to keep dodging me until you bleed to death? I thought I'd get a bit more of a fight out of you than this. I guess the Blackwatch boy has brought out a soft side in you. Whipper's thoughts filled her head. Why are you doing this? Why do you think? For the good of the pack. Freya balked at the words. For the good of the pack. The line that covered a multitude of sins. The beta heard her thoughts. You've always failed to see the big picture, Freya. That's your weakness. You let the death of one useless wolf cloud your decisions. One useless wolf. She was part of our pack. She was a girl who made a mistake. She was in love. Oh, God, please, don't. And don't try that act on me. Act? I was there, remember? I saw what you did. I was in your head. I heard every thought. I know the truth. You enjoyed it. You enjoyed the power. You enjoyed killing her. No! Freya leapt through the air now, slamming her mighty paws with their razor-sharp claws against Whipper's neck. But she'd barely made contact when Whipper twisted and turned, pinning her to the ground. The pair tumbled one over the other, landing almost exactly where Freya had started. You know, I've dreamed of this. Whipper's thoughts once again pierced her mind. I thought I'd have to wait years. Lena would never let me kill you while she was still in charge. I always assumed I'd have to wait to overthrow her before I could get to you. You couldn't be half the alpha my mother is. We'll see. Whipper's weight was full on her now, her thoughts digging into her mind too. Freya had to shut her out. That was the first thing. With Whipper in her head, she knew she didn't stand a chance against the mind games. You think you can block me out? Whipper sneered, their thoughts still tied. Maybe when there's a full pack you can slip under the radar, but not now. I beg to differ. It took a mountain of concentration, a surge of energy that rushed up from her feet, through her back, and throbbed around her skull. Then, like a rubber band snapping, the link was severed. Whipper snarled, jumping backwards, momentarily freeing Freya from her hold. Adrenaline flooded Freya's veins. Now at least she could act without Whipper hearing her every move planned, although what she could do was still a mystery to her. She had intended to sew herself up, after leaving a small pool of blood. But to do that she needed to be human, and she'd already lost far more blood than she'd intended. The snarling grew in volume as Whipper prepared to launch herself into the air again. Foam dripped from the wolf's jaw. This was it, Freya knew. If Whipper got her teeth into her this time, it would be the end. But she couldn't afford to dive away again. Each bound had cost her more and more blood and ripped her cut wider and deeper. She turned her head, searching for a way out, searching for a miracle. And there, in the long grass, it glinted. Her timing had been flawless in spite of the pain. As Whipper leapt towards her, Freya transformed back into human form, rolling over in the grass as she did so. She grabbed hold of the knife. As the beta came down, the blade impaled her. With each whine and whimper, Freya pushed it in deeper and deeper, until the full weight of Whipper lay square on her body, her blood-soaked fur draped over Freya's skin. Death was quick, as the rattle of blood in her lungs stilled and the wrenching pain, as every organ shut down, ceased. Whipper's last gurgling breath sounded in her ears. How Freya found the strength to move afterward, she didn't know. But somehow, when all had fallen silent, except for the sound of her own panting breath, she rolled out from underneath the dead beast. So much blood covered her body it was impossible to know which was her own, though from the pain that now gripped her side, a great deal must have come from her. And it wasn't just her side now. Whipper had taken a chunk out of her shoulder, and the whole of her left thigh was blue with bruising. Limping her way to the bottle of alcohol, she opened the lid and poured some over her wounds. Ah! The pain was worse than the knife in her side had been, and the blood flowed even faster. There was definitely no going back now. She couldn't move the wolf's body. It would take all her full strength, and now her knees were trembling, just from the effort it took to stand. Taking the needle, thread, and bandages from her bag, she started patching up the wound on her side. This time she made no attempt to ease the pain with a stick between her jaws. The once neat cut had now torn in so many places. Her only option was to leave the stitches loose. Otherwise, each step would just see it pulling open. With the work completed as best she could, she wound a bandage around her torso, stuffed everything back in her bag, and started the long walk through the forest. She didn't walk past Whipper or the deer. She couldn't face them again. By the evening, they would find the bodies. They would make their own conclusions as to what had happened. They knew the vendetta. Some would assume Whipper attacked first. Others would blame her. Either way, she was no longer part of the pack. Every few miles she stopped to spill more water and alcohol on the ground, in an attempt to weaken the scent. When she stumbled past the sweet spirea, she pulled off a handful of white flowers and rubbed them against the soles of her feet to mask her scent. She repeated the same action a mile later, when she passed a weeping silver lime. She would keep walking, until either she reached the road or died on her feet. They were her only options now. Sunset had fallen when the forest started to thin. Her head pounded, and her legs burned so badly she thought she would never recover. When the road appeared, her knees buckled. Gravel stung her skin as she fell into the dust. Her eyes closed. Relief flooded through her. At least Michael would find her and know she hadn't given up on him. At least he would know she had tried. As her breath weakened, a sound caught in her ears. Footsteps, slow at first, then faster and faster. She had no more strength left to keep going. Even as the sound of footsteps raced towards her, she failed to keep herself upright. As her eyes closed, she toppled forwards, waiting for the thud as she hit the ground. Instead, she landed on the soft cotton of his shirt. "It's okay, Freya. I'm here. I've got you now. I've got you." This has been Man and Wolf, a delicious urban fantasy werewolf romance novella. Dark Creatures Prequel Collection, Book 3. Written by Ella Stone. Narrated by Naomi Rose Mock. Copyright 2021 by Ella Stone. Production copyright by Ella Stone.